Judy from Patterns for Pirates, and I'm going to sew up some fierce undies with you today. I have my pieces here. I am doing the mid-rise thong option. So I have a front, a back, and my waistband piece. I have an 1.5 inch soft waistband elastic. I also have some clear elastic to go along the legs. This just helps it not get stretched out during the day as you're pulling them up and down. So let's get started. Okay, we're gonna start off by grabbing our main front and main back and putting them right sides together. And I am going to align the side seams and stitch with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. On most sergers, they'll give you a 1/4 inch finished seam. So that means I'm going to be trimming off 1/8 of an inch. Okay, and grab my crotch lining piece, and I am just going to show this step quickly. This is an optional step you can do. You can trim down your seam allowance, which is 3/8 of an inch, all along the sides. And what that does is reduce the bulk in your hem around the legs. I don't find I can tell very much, if I'm perfectly honest, but in a thong, since the seam allowance is so close together anyways, I went ahead and did it this time. So you leave your underwear just like this, right sides together, just like you just sewed the seam allowances, and we're going to match these back notches. I'm going to flip my underwear where my back side is on the top. And then I'm going to add my crotch lining piece at that center notch as well. It's going to be face down. So the right side of my lining piece to the wrong side of my back piece. And they're all going to line at this center notch. Okay, so I'm just going to try to show this from a few more views just in case. I have my front on the bottom, my back in the middle, and my lining piece on top. They are all aligned at the center notch. My back and my front should meet perfectly. If I did not trim my seam allowance, this will also meet perfectly. But since I did trim my seam allowance, it's smaller by 3/8 of an inch that I trimmed. And I'm going to stitch that seam together. Ooh! Now what we're going to do is open this up and press our liner to the front. If I did not trim my seam allowance, it will match perfectly to the front. If I did, it will be narrow by 3/8 of an inch that I trimmed. You can leave your liner raw if you prefer. You can finish it with your favorite finishing stitch, a serger or overlocker, a zigzag overcast stitch. Sometimes I just leave mine raw, and sometimes I finish it off. So we're going to press that to the front. Press this seam with your iron. I'm going to pin it in place, and then I'm going to take it to my sewing machine, and I am going to baste up both sides. Okay, here I am. I basted up both sides, making sure it's nice and flat. Next, we're going to do our waistband. So I'm going to grab my waistband, and I am going to butt my waistband edges up against each other. I'm not going to overlap. I'm going to butt them up against each other. And I'm going to go to my sewing machine, and I am going to do the widest zigzag stitch that my machine can do. I like to start slightly below the edge and then back up, go all the way down, and then all the way back up. My favorite settings for this is the widest zigzag my machine will go, which is a width of 7. And I like to make my stitch length a little bit shorter at 1. And again, I start here, I go back, I go all the way down, and then all the way back up again. And I'll show you that. Okay. I really like the 1 stitch length because I like to go down and back up. If you only want to go down one time, you might want to shorten it even more. Really get those stitches packed in there really tightly. Take your time here, really lining up your elastic on the bottom and top edges. Again, I start down about 1/4 of an inch, and then I like to back up to the very top. Just find my machine likes that a little bit better rather than starting at the very edge. Making sure to push that elastic all the way together the whole way down. Go all the way to the very edge, and I like to back all the way back up. Here we go. So it's a nice thick zigzag. It's nice and flat since we didn't overlap. You really want to get a very wide zigzag to make sure that you are catching enough of each side of the elastic that it's not going to fray on you. A common practice that some people like to do that get nervous with this method is on the back side they use a very small scrap of woven fabric along the back to stabilize it. I've never had a problem as long as I'm using a stretch needle, a very, very wide zigzag, and a shorter stitch length to really get those packed in there and make sure that there's no part of this elastic that isn't covered and isn't going to fray. But you can, if you're nervous or you're struggling getting your zigzag packed tight enough, you can use a little scrap of woven fabric right here to help stabilize it so your machine can really pack those stitches in tight. Now I'm going to take my waistband and I'm just going to mark it into quarters. So I'm going to use that seam as my starting point, and I'm going to fold and find the halfway mark. Then I'm going to align those halfway marks and fold out to find my quarter points. I'm marking with pins, but you can mark with whatever you have and your preferences, clips or a pin, marking pin. Okay, I'm going to grab my underwear, a little clear ruler, and some sort of marking tool. I'm going to grab this pin that the mark will go away once you add heat. I really like these pins. They are Frixion, I think is how you pronounce it. Frixion, I'm not sure. But I just grab a pack almost every year when the school supplies come out. I like to get the rainbow colors, although I will warn you, if you have little ones that venture into your sewing room, they also really love the rainbow colors, so beware of that. I lose a lot of pins and a lot of ink due to these rainbow colors. What I'm doing is marking 3/8 inch away from the top edge. When I mark on knit fabric, usually what I do is do a lot of little dots like this. That way, if you're pulling like this, it's going to stretch your fabric. It usually doesn't like that very much. You don't get a very good mark, and you're stretching your fabric. It can be frustrating. So what I usually find works best is dot, 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 dot. You just need enough that your eye can make a line from it. It doesn't need to be a solid line. And I'm going to do that on the front and the back. I really recommend this step. It might seem a tiny bit tedious, but it makes attaching the elastic so much easier. I promise any time that you take marking this line, you're going to gain on the next step, because if you do not mark it, you're going to spend a lot longer attaching the waistband, fiddling, and trying to align it without a visual on the front. I really, really think it's worth this little tiny extra time it takes to mark a line. One other thing you can do that's very quick is run a quick basting stitch. Just be sure not to stretch out your underwear. Okay. Voila! So now I have that marked line all the way across, and I am going to mark the top into quarters as well. So I always cut center notches. Anything that I'm cutting on the fold, when I'm cutting out, I just throw a little notch on there. Most of the time when you're sewing, you always have to find center points. And, you know, doing it when you're cutting is so quick and easy. So much faster than finding it after you've been cutting and sewing. Okay. And now I'm just going to align my waistband to the bottom of my waistband to this line that I've marked. Your seam you can either put in the center back, or you can put it on the side, whatever your preference is. And you know, I don't have a strong preference either way. Sometimes I put it in the center back, and sometimes I put it on the side. It just depends on my mood, I guess. So I'm going to pin, I'm going to put it on the side this time. There's no rhyme or reason to it, I just feel like it today, I guess. Your waistband should be very close to the same finish width as your underwear. If you took the correct seam allowance, cut very carefully, etc., it should be exactly the same. If it's not, you can press your underwear. Maybe they got stretched out while you were working with them. Or you can double check that you cut the right waistband. As you can see, mine is lining up just so. But you know, sometimes it moves a little bit when we cut, or we accidentally took a little more or less seam allowance. But it should match up perfectly. You shouldn't need to stretch as you attach. So I'm going to take this to my cover stitch machine, and I'm just going to stitch along this bottom. You don't need to catch the very edge of the elastic. You can go right above it, and you can stitch this on with your favorite high stretch stitch. So I usually use my cover stitch on the wider needle setting. I just prefer the wider needle because it takes up most of that 3/8 seam allowance and I don't have to trim very much off. Ready wear can vary, but a lot of ready wear, when they do exposed elastic, will do the three needles. You can also use your sewing machine, of course. My favorite stitch to use on my sewing machine is a triple step zigzag, and I just use the factory settings. I find it super stretchy, super easy to work with. I like to sew from the top of my fabric, and I am just constantly making sure that I'm aligning this bottom edge of the elastic to my marked line. I shouldn't need to stretch my elastic, so all I'm worrying about is aligning this and making sure that my fabric isn't curling too bad on the underneath in my seam allowance. And that's just to make sure it doesn't curl up and get caught in there and have a little bit of bulkiness. So I'll be right back with it cover stitched on. Alright, so I cover stitched along the top. My thread was white, so you can't see it very well on this top side, but you can see I tried my best aligning the bottom elastic to that marked line. And then on the inside you can see my cover stitch loopers. And now I'll just need to go back and trim my back and center notches. You can also trim any seam allowance that is peeking out. I recommend very small, precise scissors. I love these little, I believe they're embroidery scissors. So even if it's super tiny little seam allowance, I prefer to trim it all the way down. I find it the most comfortable and looks nice, but if it doesn't bother you, leave it. They're your undies, right? Here's just my serger tail on the side seam. Make sure you go nice and slow here too. You don't want to accidentally snip your waistband or any of your threads. You go nice and slow. That's why these teeny tiny scissors are really nice. Here is my back center notch. I have one more little spot right here. Okay, we're all trimmed up. And now we just need to hem the legs under. I do recommend using a clear elastic in some of the options. You'll notice if you go and feel a bunch of your ready-to-wear underwear that they have a thin, clear elastic enclosed in the legs. And all that does is keep it from losing its shape and getting saggy bottoms during the day, which nobody wants. I do highly recommend one particular brand of clear elastic. I usually find that, you know, things like elastic I'm not brand specific or loyal to, but for underwear and honestly just in general, the brand Lastine is very soft and very thin and very stretchy. They claim it's 2/3 thinner than your average or than any other clear elastics, They also claim that it stretches longer, and I find it absolutely very true. Compared to the elastic that I can get at my local stores or any other clear elastic I've ordered, the elastine is much, much thinner and much, much stretchier. And so when doing something like underwear where you're really concerned with how comfortable it is going to be, I really recommend taking that extra step and ordering that specific brand for your unders. You want to exercise your elastic, which is what I'm doing right now. Clear elastic, it's really important to exercise your elastic. It's very tight out of the container. And I actually am not using elastine right now. I ran out. I've sewn so many underwear, you guys. They're so quick and simple and fun to make. But I ran out, so I'm waiting on an Amazon order for some more. So I am using the thicker, less stretchy, I believe this is a Dritz brand. So I'm going to exercise mine a lot. And when I say a lot, I mean I almost feel like I'm going to snap it. Because it's thicker and it's not as stretchy, it's really important to exercise it. The difference between before and after, really, really aggressively exercising is a big difference. And so since it's so much thicker and tighter than the other brand, it's really important to be aggressive. So when I'm stretching, I'm not kidding, I feel like if I pull any tighter, it's going to stretch, and honestly, I can't pull any tighter. I can't rip this. So I am pulling as tight as I can, as much length as I think, and plus a little bit more just to be safe. I'm going to show you how to attach this on my machine, and then I'm also going to show you attaching it on the serger. And I will just have to live with these underwear that have mismatched legs. That's how much I love you guys. I will live with mismatched seams. Okay, so I'm going to attach it with a long straight stitch. I'm going to put my needle in the center and do a long basting stitch. If you're having a hard time with your foot wanting to move, I'm going to start near the seam. You can use a Teflon foot, which I find helps a lot. I did not pull mine out for this video. I usually attach mine with my serger. I prefer it to my sewing machine because it seems to feed through easier. Like I said, on my sewing machine, I actually feel like I need a Teflon foot for it to feed through nicely. And as you can see, I trimmed off that 3/8 seam allowance, so it just tucks in there, fits in there perfectly. I am not stretching, I'm just letting it feed through exactly the same as my, I'm going to trim that little serger tail off. Not too short, I don't want it to unravel before I hem this. Make sure you are not pulling that at all, you're just letting it feed through. And I'm just aligning the edges here. If you're having a difficult time attaching your clear elastic, I really do recommend trying out that other brand. I find it much easier to work with. It's got, since it's so much thinner, my machine tends to feed it through a lot easier, as well as it's got some texture to it, some lines down, vertical lines through it, and I find that's easier for me to hold and grab and work with as well. sound like a commercial for that brand, but I really do find it much nicer. I'm a little sad that I'm out and having to use this brand for these adorable underwear. So I'm doing the thong option. The thong option, you do not stretch at all at any part. If you're doing the brief option around the booty curve, you're not really going to stretch, but I suggest you pull it taut. Just around the booty curve. Okay, so there it is. It's aligned at the edge, spaced in between. Now you have to be careful not to stretch that fabric at all, or your basting stitches will pop. So now I'm going to go to the serger, and I'm going to do the exact same thing just with my serger and show you what that looks like. Okay, now I'm over here at my serger. I've aggressively stretched out and exercised my elastic again. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm just showing you on my serger. A lot of people are nervous about this step, attaching the elastic. So I thought I'd show on both machines just in case it helped anybody out to see it on one versus the other. A lot of people who have a serger, oh, I didn't get it caught in there. I do find this a little trickier, getting it started off. What I often do is stick a pin in my clear elastic, slide it under there, put my foot down, and then very carefully slide my pin out so that it's right where I want it and it gets caught right away. Otherwise, I find it difficult to try sliding them both in. So it's the same thing. I am not stretching my fabric. I'm not stretching my elastic. Just aligning them. And you're not going to trim anything off, so you can actually turn off or disengage your knife as well. I usually do that just in case I start going a little bit fast. And I'm going to turn it back on just to trim this serger tail for me, so I don't have to worry about it being bulky in that spot. Go nice and slow. This is something that you just want to take your time with. Just let your machine do all the work for you. I'm going to turn my knife back on to get that serger tail again. Again, I am not stretching, pulling. Just letting my serger pull it through nice and evenly. I'm going to trim off my elastic. My serger tail, and as you can see, it's the exact same thing. Just one has a straight stitch and one has a serged seam. I do find it slightly quicker to do it on my serger just because I can go a bit faster. And as you can see, even though I wasn't pulling, my machine tended to ease in the fabric a little bit more than my serger did. So that is why I prefer it. My sewing machine, unless I'm using a Teflon foot, it will still ease the fabric in slightly, which means it's going to feel a little bit tighter. Versus my serger, who did a little bit better job doing it one-to-one without easing the fabric in. But you can do it either way, and whichever way you prefer, you can practice and get better and better. Now, all we're going to do is take that 3/8 elastic and we're going to fold it under and hem it. We're going to do that on both sides. On the thong option, it pretty much takes up about all of your little back piece right here, which of course you want very thin on the thong option. And so I'm going to take this to my cover stitch and stitch around both legs, and I'll be right back. Alright, I thought I'd show you just a little bit of me hemming it under. It's very easy to fold under the 3/8 since that's exactly the width of the elastic. You can see my serger is about 1/4 inch, and then I have 1 more 1/8 there. My edge of my foot happens to be a 3/8 on my cover stitch machine, so it's a nice, easy hem allowance for me. That means when I turn it under, I'm going to get right on the edge, and I will have that 1/8 of an inch showing. Around some of the curves, you'll see that you have to stretch your elastic slightly to fit to your underwear, and that's because when you fold it in, it's on a very slightly longer line than the edge of the fabric was. So with all curves, when you're hemming under and the curve is going in, you're going to have to very slightly stretch, the edge being pulled under to that longer edge it's being top stitched to. There we go, and you can see here that you cannot see where I trimmed it away. Where I trimmed it away is this part being folded over. So here's this side. See, I trimmed it away where the elastic is, and then once the elastic gets folded over, you don't see where it's trimmed away. But there's just one less layer in that hem. There is only 3 layers versus 4. So if you are sensitive to that, you can trim it. Alright, I'm just going to lock my stitches here. And I can show you one more time. From the outside and from the inside, so you can see my pink serged edge and then the lavender looper. So if you are worried about thickness, maybe that is something to consider about serging versus using your sewing machine, because the basting stitch I will pull out, whereas my serged edge gets stuck in there forever and always. So if you are concerned with how thick that hem is, you can think about attaching with your sewing machine versus your serger, since it's not going to add any bulk. I'm going to do the same thing with my other side. I just have that elastic folded under 3/8 of an inch, and I am going to repeat that hemming. Alright, so here we are all hemmed up. This would be my one that I serged, and this would be my one that I did with my machine. So, you know, in the end, it's fine either way. My serge will stay in there, whereas this side I will pull my basting stitch and I will also pull my basting stitches holding that crotch liner in place. Just a nice dark purple with this one, so it should be easy to grab and pull out. And I used a white thread for my clear elastic, so that'll be much harder to pull out for me. I won't make you suffer through watching me find the white thread. But really, if you pull it, it usually kind of pops up away from the fabric. Okay, and here we are with our complete pair of Fierce Undies. Again, I have the mid-rise thong option. I used a pretty wide elastic. It's 1.5 inches. And so the rise will come up pretty high since my elastic is that thick. Of course, if I used a 3/4, you know, the rise would be a whole 3/4 of an inch lower. So what width elastic you use will drastically change how high or low your rise is. This is the side that I serged my elastic onto, and this is the side that I did it with my sewing machine. And from the back side, this is the side that I serged it with. This is the side that I did it with my sewing machine. So you can see this one is a tiny bit tighter. You can see it's pulling a little bit this way. So it's a tiny bit tighter, but I'm not sure you could tell it's tighter when it's on. I guess I'll let you know when I try them on. Oh, I found a thread that needs trimmed. This pair is cotton spandex. Both the mane and the lining are cotton spandex. It's my absolute favorite for the Fierce Undies. I've used thinner and I've used thicker, and really just any cotton spandex is perfectly fine. I used another jersey for some, and they're okay, but they tend to not have as good of recovery as my cotton spandex ones. Cotton spandex tends to have good recovery, and it's also very breathable, which is nice for underwear. And it's so easy to find great little prints, and underwear is something that you can go wild on prints and things like that. And so have fun while you can and get those cute prints. And I can't wait to see your fun, cute Fierce Undies.